My father handed my son a broken toy, and then he laughed as he'd just made the best joke of the night. At that moment, in a room full of family, noise, and forced smiles, I watched my 8-year-old son sit on the floor, holding that box like it actually mattered. Right as he tore the paper open, revealing a cheap plastic laptop with a cracked screen that wouldn't even turn on, my father leaned forward, looked straight at him, and said to him, "That's probably all you need. Something simple enough for you to understand." Immediately after that, a couple of people laughed out loud, while others stayed quiet in that uncomfortable way people do when they know something's wrong but don't want to be the one to say it. In that instant, my hands clenched so tight I could feel my knuckles go numb, but I couldn't move because I needed to see how my son would react. Right then, Liam tilted his head, pressed the button again, and softly said to me, "It's okay. I can try to fix it." At that moment, my heart didn't just break, it sank. Because that wasn't hope, that was a habit. And right there, in front of everyone, I realized my son had already learned how to accept being treated like he didn't matter. In that second, something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't stop anymore. And 20 minutes later, I said one sentence that tore my family apart forever. "Hi everyone, I'm Alicia. I'm 38 years old. And this story happened last Thanksgiving." Earlier that afternoon, as I kept my eyes on the road, driving from Austin toward my father's house, I glanced over at Liam sitting quietly in the passenger seat, holding his small backpack on his lap, like it was something he needed to protect. Right then, trying to sound more confident than I actually felt, I said to him, "Hey, it's just dinner, okay? We'll eat, say hi, and head out early." Immediately after that, Liam gave a small nod and softly said to me, "Yeah, I'll be good." At that moment, my chest tightened a little because he always said that. Not, "I'm excited," not, "I can't wait," just, "I'll be good." Right then, I forced a smile and said to him, "You don't have to be perfect, you know. Just be yourself." A second later, he looked out the window and quietly said to me, "I know, I just don't want them to think I'm weird." At that instant, my grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I felt that familiar mix of anger and guilt rising inside me. Because the truth was, he didn't learn that fear on his own. He learned it from them. As the road stretched out in front of us, I kept thinking about how I ended up here again. I'm a freelance graphic designer, which sounds flexible and creative, but most months it just means unstable income, late payments, and constantly trying to prove I'm doing real work. And in my family, if you weren't making 6 figures or climbing some corporate ladder, you were basically invisible. Right then, exhaling slowly, I said to him, "Hey, whatever happens tonight, I've got you, okay?" Immediately after that, Liam looked at me for a second, then gave a small smile and said, "I know you do." At that moment, something inside me softened, but it didn't last long, because the closer we got, the more the past started creeping back in. My father had always been like that, cold, sharp, and very clear about who mattered and who didn't. And it was never me. It was always my younger brother, Ryan. Successful, confident, the kind of person who walked into a room and got respect without even trying. Right then, swallowing hard, I whispered more to myself than to Liam, "Maybe it'll be different this time." A second later, as the car turned onto the familiar street lined with identical houses and perfectly trimmed lawns, Liam leaned forward slightly and said to me, "Is this it?" At that moment, my heart started beating faster, and I forced a calm tone as I said to him, "Yeah, this is it." Immediately after that, as I pulled into the driveway I hadn't seen in over a year, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered something I didn't want to admit. Something felt off. And still, I told myself this time might be different. The moment we walked in, I knew nothing had changed. As soon as I pushed the door open and stepped into that warm, brightly lit living room, my father glanced up from across the room, barely held eye contact, and casually said to me, "You made it. Took you long enough." Right after that, before I could even respond, Ryan walked over with a wide smile, clapped my father on the shoulder, and said to him, "Hey, I brought that wine you like, the expensive one." Immediately, my father's face lit up, and he leaned forward with real interest as he said to him, "Now that's what I'm talking about. You always know how to show up right." At that moment, I stood there holding my coat, feeling invisible in my own family, while Liam quietly stepped closer to me, his small hand brushing against mine like he needed grounding. Right then, trying to keep things normal, I gently nudged him forward and said to him, "Go ahead, say hi." A second later, Liam looked up, gave a shy smile, and softly said to the room, "Hi." Immediately after that, Chloe glanced down at him briefly, then looked away and said in a flat tone to no one in particular, "He's quiet." At that instant, a wave of discomfort ran through me, but I forced a polite smile as I said to her, "He just takes a minute to warm up." Right then, without even looking at me, she shrugged and said to Ryan, "Sophie was reading full sentences at that age, remember?" At that moment, I felt my jaw tighten. But before I could respond, Sophie ran into the room holding a tablet, waving it excitedly as she said to everyone, "Look, I finished another level." Immediately, the entire room shifted. Ryan leaned down, beaming with pride, and said to her, "That's amazing. Show me how you did it." Right after that, my father chuckled warmly and said to her, "You're going to be smarter than all of us, aren't you?" At that instant, Liam stood still beside me, watching everything quietly, his eyes following the attention as it moved around the room, just not toward him. Right then, I crouched slightly beside him and softly said to him, "It's okay. Come sit with me." A second later, he nodded and said to me, "I'm okay. I can just watch." At that moment, my chest tightened again, because I recognized that tone, that quiet acceptance of being on the outside. Across the room, my father finally looked at me again, crossed his arms, and said to me, "So, you still doing those little design gigs?" Immediately after that, I straightened slightly and said to him, "Yeah, I've been getting more clients lately." Right then, he gave a small dismissive nod and said to me, "Well, as long as it pays the bills, I guess." At that instant, a slow burn of frustration started building inside me, but I swallowed it down, like I always did. Before the silence could stretch too long, Aunt Melissa walked over with a warm smile, gently touched my arm, and said to me, "I'm really glad you came. It's been too long." Right then, I exhaled softly and said to her, "Yeah, it has." At that moment, she crouched slightly to Liam's level, smiled kindly, and said to him, "Hey, I heard you like fixing things. Is that true?" Immediately after that, Liam's face lit up just a little, and he nodded as he said to her, "Yeah, I like figuring out how stuff works." At that instant, something in my chest loosened, just a bit, seeing someone actually notice him. But it didn't last. Right then, Ryan raised his voice from across the room and said to everyone, "Hey, come sit down. I want to tell you guys about this deal I just closed." Immediately, people gathered around, chairs pulled in, attention locked on him like he was the center of gravity. At that moment, I sat down quietly with Liam beside me, already knowing exactly how the rest of the night was going to go. And still, I told myself to let it go, at least until the conversation turned to something I couldn't ignore anymore. It started with a simple question, and turned into something else. As everyone settled around the dinner table, plates passed, glasses filled, and that familiar rhythm of small talk began, my father leaned back in his chair, glanced toward Liam, and casually said to him, "So, how's school going for you?" Right after that, Liam froze for a second, then looked down at his hands and softly said to him, "It's okay. I like science." Immediately after that, my father gave a short nod, then tilted his head slightly, and said to him, "Just okay? You should be doing more than okay at your age." At that instant, I felt my stomach tighten, and I quickly stepped in, trying to ease the moment as I said to him, "He's doing fine. He just started a new program." Right then, Ryan wiped his mouth with a napkin, leaned forward with a confident smile, and said to the table, Sophie just tested 2 grades ahead in math. Her teacher says she might qualify for a gifted track. Immediately, Chloe beamed with pride and added to everyone, "Yeah, she's been reading chapter books since she was 5." At that moment, my father nodded approvingly, then glanced back at Liam and said to him, "See, that's what happens when kids are pushed a little." At that instant, a low heat started building in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm as I said to him, "Every kid moves at their own pace." Right then, Chloe let out a small laugh, barely hiding the edge in her voice, and said to me, "Of course, but some kids just have it, you know?" Immediately after that, the table went quiet for a split second, the kind of silence that says everyone heard it, but no one wants to call it out. At that moment, Liam sat still beside me, his fork resting untouched on his plate, his eyes fixed on the table like he was trying to disappear. Right then, I leaned slightly toward him and softly said to him, "Hey, you're doing great, okay?" A second later, he nodded without looking up and quietly said to me, "Yeah, I know." At that instant, my chest tightened even more, because I could hear it in his voice that he didn't fully believe it. Across the table, my father shook his head lightly, then said to me, "Kids need direction, otherwise they fall behind." Immediately after that, Ryan added with a half smile, "It's just about setting the right standards early." At that moment, something inside me started to crack, but I still held it in, still trying to keep the peace as I said to them, "He's not behind, he's just different." Right then, Chloe raised an eyebrow, gave a tight smile, and said to me, "Different is one way to put it." Immediately after that, a couple of people shifted in their seats, the tension now impossible to ignore. At that instant, my hands tightened around my fork, my knuckles turning pale as I tried to steady myself, my mind spinning while my body stayed still. And right beside me, Liam said nothing. He just sat there quietly, listening, absorbing every word like it was something he was supposed to accept. At that moment, I realized something that hit harder than anything they had said out loud. He wasn't confused. He understood exactly what they meant. And he was getting used to it. Right then, I swallowed hard, trying to push the feeling down, telling myself not to ruin the night, not yet. Because I thought maybe, just maybe, it would stop here. But I was wrong. Because a few minutes later, the gifts came out. When the gifts came out, everything changed. Right after dinner, as plates were cleared and people slowly moved back into the living room, Ryan clapped his hands together, looked around with a grin, and said to everyone, "All right, let's do gifts." Sophie's been waiting all night. Immediately after that, a wave of excitement filled the room, chairs shifted, wrapping paper boxes were brought out, and kids gathered near the decorated corner as if it were the main event. At that moment, Liam stood slightly behind me, his fingers lightly gripping the edge of my sweater, watching quietly as the other kids sat closer to the pile. Right then, I turned to him, gave a soft smile, and said to him, "Hey, go sit with them, it's okay." A second later, he hesitated, then nodded and softly said to me, "Okay, I'll try." Immediately after that, he walked over and sat at the edge of the group, not too close, not too far, like he already knew exactly where he was supposed to be. Right then, Chloe picked up a neatly wrapped box, handed it to Sophie with excitement, and said to her, "This one's from us. Go ahead, open it." A second later, Sophie tore the paper open, her eyes lighting up as she held up a brand new tablet and said to everyone, "It's the one I wanted." Immediately, the room erupted with praise. Ryan leaned in, smiling proudly, and said to her, "Of course it is. You earned it." My father chuckled warmly, nodding as he said to her, "That's what happens when you work hard." At that instant, I felt a familiar tension creeping back into my chest, but I kept my eyes on Liam. He clapped softly along with everyone else, a small smile on his face, like he was trying to match the energy around him. Right after that, more gifts were passed around, each one nicer than the last. A remote control car, a set of headphones, and art kits, all met with cheers, laughter, and constant attention. And through it all, Liam sat quietly, waiting, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes occasionally flicking toward me like he was checking if his turn was coming. At that moment, a quiet unease started building inside me. Something didn't feel right. Right then, my father stood up slowly, reached down beside his chair, and picked up a small box, noticeably smaller than the others. He turned it in his hands for a second, then looked across the room and said to him, "Hey, Liam, this one's for you." Immediately after that, the room seemed to shift just slightly. Not loud, not obvious, but enough for me to feel it. A pause. A hesitation. At that instant, Liam looked surprised, then quickly stood up, walked over carefully, and took the box with both hands as if it meant something important. Right then, he looked up at my father and softly said to him, "Thank you." A second later, my father gave a short nod, leaned back into his chair, and said to him, "Go ahead, open it." At that moment, I felt my heartbeat start to pick up, my fingers tightening unconsciously at my sides as I watched Liam sit back down and slowly begin to unwrap the paper. Something felt wrong. Right then, as the last piece of wrapping paper fell away and that cheap plastic toy appeared in his hands, the entire room went quiet for just a second too long. And in that silence, I knew. He handed Liam the box like it meant nothing. At that moment, as the last piece of wrapping paper slipped from Liam's hands and landed softly on the floor, he lifted the small plastic laptop and pressed the button once, then again, waiting for something to happen. But immediately after that, nothing did. The screen stayed black, the keys felt loose under his fingers, and the hinge was slightly cracked like it had already been used and thrown aside. Right then, my father leaned forward in his chair, rested his elbows on his knees, and said to him with a faint smirk, "Try it again. Maybe it just needs a little encouragement." And a second later, a few quiet chuckles spread across the room. Light at first, then just enough to make it real. At that instant, my chest tightened so hard it almost hurt to breathe, but I didn't move. I couldn't, because I was watching Liam. Right then, he pressed the button one more time, waited, then looked up slowly and said to him, "I don't think it's working." Immediately after that, my father let out a short laugh, leaned back, and said to him, "Well, I figured it didn't need to work perfectly, just something simple for you to play with." At that moment, Chloe covered her mouth, trying to hide a smile. Ryan shook his head slightly without saying anything, and around them, a few people avoided eye contact while others stayed completely still, and no one stepped in. Right then, Liam looked down at the toy again, ran his fingers gently over the cracked edge, and softly said to him, "It's okay, I think I can fix it." At that instant, something inside me broke in a way I hadn't felt before. My throat closed, my vision blurred slightly, and a cold wave ran through my body as I realized what I was really seeing. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't disappointment. This was familiarity. Right then, my hands curled into fists at my sides, my knuckles turning pale as my heart pounded hard against my chest, while my mind went completely still. I wasn't hearing the room anymore. I wasn't seeing anyone else. I was only seeing my son sitting there accepting it. Immediately after that, my father shook his head lightly, still amused, and said to the room, "See, that's a good attitude. Doesn't expect too much." And a second later, a couple of people laughed again, softer this time, but it was enough. At that moment, I felt like I was standing outside my own body, watching the same scene I had lived through years ago, just with a different child in my place. Right then, I took a small step forward without realizing it, my body moving before my thoughts could catch up, my chest tight, my breathing uneven, because in that instant I understood something I had been avoiding for years. If I stayed quiet now, I was teaching my son that this was normal, and I couldn't do that. At that moment, my heart slammed hard in my chest, my mind racing while my body stood frozen, caught between fear and something stronger rising underneath it. I wasn't angry at first. I was ashamed. I wasn't angry at first. I was ashamed. At that moment, standing there in the middle of the room while the quiet laughter slowly faded, I kept my eyes on Liam sitting on the floor, still holding that broken toy like it was something worth keeping. And right then, barely able to steady my voice, I said to him, "Hey, you don't have to play with that if you don't want to." A second later, he looked up at me with that same small, careful smile, and softly said to me, "It's okay, I like fixing things." Immediately after that, my chest tightened so sharply, it felt like something inside me cracked open, because in that instant I realized he wasn't trying to stay positive, he was trying to make it easier for me. Right then, I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I said to him, "You don't have to make it okay for me." At that moment, he hesitated, then looked down again and quietly said to me, "I'm not. I just don't want them to think I'm bad." At that instant, my hands started to tremble, a cold wave running through my body while my mind spun, because those words didn't belong to a child. They belonged to someone who had already learned how to shrink themselves just to be accepted. Right then, I took a slow breath, trying to hold everything together, but my thoughts pulled me backward without warning, back to another table, another room, another version of me sitting exactly where he was now. Immediately after that, I heard my father's voice in my memory, sharper, younger, saying to me, "If you can't keep up, you're just slowing everyone down." At that moment, my chest tightened even more, not just from what was happening now, but from the realization that nothing had changed. Not really. The same tone, the same judgment, the same quiet humiliation dressed up as just a joke. Right then, I looked back at Liam, really looked at him, the way he sat a little smaller than he should, the way he watched people before speaking, the way he had already learned to expect less. Immediately after that, something inside me shifted. Not loud, not explosive, but deep and irreversible. At that instant, I felt both my past and my present collide in a way I couldn't ignore anymore, my heart pounding hard while my mind became strangely clear. This wasn't just about tonight. This wasn't just about a broken toy. This was a pattern. Right then, my fingers curled tightly at my sides, my knuckles pale, my body still, but something inside me rising fast, something I had held back for years. Immediately after that, I took a small step forward, my breath uneven, as I looked across the room at my father. At that moment, I realized something that hit harder than anything else. If I stayed silent now, I wasn't protecting the peace, I was protecting the problem. And I wasn't going to do that anymore. Right then, I straightened my back, my voice still quiet but no longer unsure, as I said to myself, "This stops here." At that instant, my heart pounded once, hard enough to feel in my throat, and I knew there was no going back. And then, I stood up. I looked straight at my father and said, "That's enough." At that moment, as I stepped forward into the center of the room, every small movement seemed louder than it should have been. The soft rustle of clothes, the creak of the floor, and right then, with my heart pounding hard against my chest, I looked straight at my father and said to him, "That's enough." Immediately after that, the room went quiet in a way that didn't feel normal. It felt heavy, like everyone suddenly realized something had shifted. Right then, my father leaned back slowly, raised an eyebrow, and said to me in a calm, almost amused tone, "Excuse me?" At that instant, my throat tightened, but I didn't look away, and I said to him, "I said that's enough. You don't get to talk to my son like that." Immediately after that, Ryan let out a short breath, shook his head slightly, and said to me, "Come on, you're overreacting. It was just a joke." At that moment, I felt a surge of heat rise through my chest, but my voice stayed steady as I said to him, "No, it wasn't a joke, not to him." Right then, Chloe crossed her arms, leaned back in her chair, and said to me with a tight smile, "You're being a little sensitive. Kids need to toughen up." Immediately after that, I turned to her, my jaw tightening, and said to her, "No, kids need to feel safe, especially around family." At that instant, the silence deepened, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me, but I didn't stop. Right then, I looked back at my father, my voice firmer now, and said to him, "You gave him a broken toy, and then you laughed at him in front of everyone." Immediately after that, he shrugged lightly, dismissing it with a wave of his hand as he said to me, "It's not that serious, he didn't even care." At that moment, something inside me snapped into clarity, and I said to him, "He didn't react because he's used to it. That's the problem." Right then, a murmur moved through the room, quiet but undeniable. Ryan straightened slightly and said to me, "You're turning this into something it's not." Immediately after that, I shook my head and said to him, "No, I'm finally calling it what it is." At that instant, Aunt Melissa stepped forward from the side, her voice calm but firm as she said to the room, "She's not wrong. This isn't the first time something like this has happened." Immediately after that, the tension shifted again, heavier now, harder to ignore. Right then, my father's expression hardened, his tone colder, as he said to me, "If you don't like how things are done here, maybe you shouldn't come." At that moment, my chest tightened, but not with doubt, with certainty, and I said to him, "You're right. I shouldn't have come back expecting anything to be different." Immediately after that, I turned slightly, reached for Liam's hand, and gently pulled him up, as I said to him, "Hey, we're leaving." A second later, he looked up at me, surprised, and softly said to me, "Right now?" At that instant, I nodded, my voice quiet but unwavering as I said to him, "Yeah, right now." Right then, I looked back at the room one last time, at the people who had watched, stayed silent, or laughed, and I said to all of them, "I'm not going to let him grow up thinking this is what family feels like." Immediately after that, no one spoke. No one stopped me. No one apologized. At that moment, I turned, walked toward the door with Liam beside me, my heart pounding but my mind clearer than it had ever been. And as I stepped outside, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't coming back. 6 months later, everything looked different. At that moment, as I stood in the small kitchen of our new apartment in Seattle, watching the rain slide slowly down the window, I took a quiet breath and said to myself, "We made it." And immediately after that, the sound of light footsteps came from the hallway as Liam walked in, holding a small screwdriver set, looking up at me with a hint of excitement as he said to me, "Hey." I fixed the loose hinge on my desk. Right then, I turned toward him, surprised in the best way, and said to him, "You did? Let me see." And a second later, he nodded quickly and said to me, "Yeah, it was just one screw that needed tightening." And at that instant, something warm spread through my chest, not just pride, but relief, the kind that settles slowly after months of holding your breath. Immediately after that, I followed him into his room where everything was simple but his, a small desk by the window, a few books stacked neatly, and tools he had started collecting on his own. And right then, he pointed at the corner of the desk and said to me, "See, it doesn't wobble anymore." And at that moment, I ran my hand lightly across the surface, nodded, and said to him, "That's really good, you figured it out." And a second later, he smiled, a real smile this time, and said to me, "Yeah, I like when things make sense." At that instant, my chest tightened again, but differently now, because I remembered another moment, another broken object, another room, but this time there was no laughter, no judgment, no one watching him like he was less, just space, just quiet, just growth. Right then, I leaned lightly against the doorframe and said to him, "How's school been?" And immediately after that, he shrugged a little, but this time there was ease in his voice as he said to me, "It's better. I have a friend now." And at that moment, my heart lifted as I stepped closer and said to him, "You do? What's his name?" And a second later, he looked up and said to me, "Ethan, he likes building stuff too." At that instant, a quiet sense of peace settled inside me, not loud or overwhelming, just steady and real. And immediately after that, Liam sat down at his desk, picked up one of his tools again, and said to me, "We're gonna build something together next week." And right then, I smiled softly and said to him, "That sounds like a good plan." At that moment, as I stood there watching him, I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to feel before. He was changing, not because he had to protect himself, but because he finally had the space to grow. Right then, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the sudden sound cutting through the calm, and immediately after that, my chest tightened slightly when I saw the name on the screen. Dad. At that instant, my fingers hovered over the phone, a familiar tension creeping back in, but not the same as before. Not fear, not guilt, just distance. And right then, I picked up the phone slowly, staring at the screen as it kept ringing, and a quiet thought crossed my mind: some things change, and some things don't. And then, I answered. My father's voice was shaking when he called me. At that moment, as I held the phone to my ear and stared out at the gray Seattle sky, I heard something I had never heard before in his voice: hesitation, and right then, after a brief silence, he cleared his throat and said to me, "We need to talk." Immediately after that, my chest tightened slightly, but my voice stayed calm as I said to him, "About what?" Right then, he exhaled sharply and said to me, "Something showed up at my house, and I think it's from you." At that instant, my brow furrowed, confusion mixing with tension as I said to him, "I haven't sent you anything." Immediately after that, his tone hardened, but there was still something unstable underneath it, as he said to me, "Don't lie to me. A box showed up yesterday." Right then, I leaned against the kitchen counter, my grip tightening on the phone as I said to him, "What kind of box?" A second later, there was a pause, and then he said to me, slower this time, "A broken laptop, cheap, cracked, doesn't work." At that moment, my heart skipped, a cold feeling creeping up my spine as the image flashed in my mind, Liam sitting on the floor, holding that same kind of toy. Right then, I shook my head instinctively and said to him, "I didn't send that." Immediately after that, his voice rose slightly, frustration breaking through as he said to me, "Then who did?" Because it showed up with no return address, just dropped at the door like some kind of message. At that instant, my mind raced, but nothing made sense, and I said to him, "I don't know, but it wasn't me." Right then, he let out a bitter laugh, but it sounded forced, strained, and he said to me, "Feels a little too convenient, doesn't it?" Immediately after that, I closed my eyes for a second, steadying myself, and said to him, "You think I'd do something like that instead of just saying what I think?" At that moment, the line went quiet for a beat, and then he said to me, lower now, "After the way you left, I don't know what you'd do." At that instant, something inside me shifted again, not anger this time, but clarity, and I said to him, "I left because of what you did, not because I wanted to play games." Right then, he inhaled slowly, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his voice, only tension, maybe even fear, as he said to me, "Things haven't been stable here." Immediately after that, I frowned slightly and said to him, "What do you mean?" A second later, he hesitated, then said to me, "Business isn't doing well, deals fell through, and now this shows up." At that moment, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just distance, like I was hearing about someone else's life. Right then, he added quietly, "It feels like someone's trying to send a message." Immediately after that, I looked out the window again, rain tapping softly against the glass, and said to him, "Maybe it is, but it's not from me." At that instant, the silence returned, heavier this time, filled with things neither of us was willing to say. Right then, he finally spoke again, his voice lower, almost uncertain as he said to me, "So, that's it? You're just done?" Immediately after that, I tightened my grip on the phone, my heart steady now, and I said to him, "I'm not doing this anymore, not with you." At that moment, the words settled between us like something final. Right then, he didn't argue, didn't push, didn't try to pull me back. He just breathed on the other end of the line, and after a few seconds, the call ended. At that instant, I lowered the phone slowly, my mind quiet in a way it hadn't been before. I didn't know who sent that broken laptop, I didn't know if it was a coincidence, karma, or something else entirely. But I knew one thing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for his approval anymore.